Lucas grew up believing his father abandoned him. No letters, no explanations, just silence. After the war, with PTSD shaping his life, the only one who never left was his German shepherd, Atlas. When a lawyer told him he'd inherited a forgotten cabin worth $30,000, Lucas returned only to see it one last time before selling. The forest was still, the house frozen in time, but Atlas stopped at the doorway and refused to move. No barking, just silence. Then he scratched at a worn rug in the corner. Beneath the floorboard was a key, and behind an old picture frame, a secret that would change everything Lucas believed about being abandoned, and reveal a fight his father never finished. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and subscribe for more stories like this. Cold wind moved slowly across a quiet roadside parking lot, carrying the dry scent of pine and distant rain. The sky hung low and gray, flattening the afternoon into a muted stillness. A single pickup truck sat alone near the gravel's edge, and beside it, a German shepherd watched the horizon without blinking. Lucas Hale stood with one hand resting on the truck door, the other holding an envelope already softened from being folded too many times. At 45, Lucas had the weathered look of a man shaped by long roads and longer silences. His face was angular, cheekbones sharp beneath lightly tanned skin, a thin salt and pepper beard tracing a firm jaw. A faint scar cut across his left eyebrow, barely visible unless light caught it. His hazel eyes rarely stayed still, constantly scanning as if measuring distance, exits, and movement. His brown hair was trimmed short but uneven, streaked with gray at the temples. He carried himself with controlled stillness, shoulders slightly forward, posture guarded, the quiet stance of someone who had learned not to trust calm environments. Years in combat had left him with habits he never quite unlearned. He preferred sitting with his back to walls, woke at the smallest sound, and avoided crowded places when possible. The official diagnosis had been PTSD, but Lucas rarely used the term. To him, it was simply the way the world felt now. Unpredictable, too loud, and occasionally unreal. Silence, on the other hand, felt manageable. Atlas stood beside him, close but not touching. The German shepherd was 5 years old, large and balanced, with a black saddle coat fading into deep tan along his chest and legs. His amber eyes were steady, intelligent, and unusually calm. His ears remained upright even in stillness, and his movements were measured, deliberate. Atlas had been paired with Lucas through a veteran assistance program 2 years earlier. Since then, the dog had become both companion and anchor. He sensed rising anxiety before Lucas spoke, leaned in when breathing changed, and stayed alert when Lucas drifted inward. Atlas rarely barked. When he did, it meant something mattered. Lucas unfolded the envelope again. He already knew every line. The property in Cedar Ridge, inherited from his father. Outstanding taxes, approximately $6,000. Purchase offer, $30,000. He did the math without thinking. $24,000 after fees, enough to clear debts, enough to relocate, enough to start over. The idea felt clean, simple. His father's name on the document, however, felt distant, like reading about a stranger. Lucas remembered fragments, the smell of sawdust, heavy boots on wood, a low voice speaking softly. Then one day, those memories stopped. His mother packed quickly. They left. No explanation, only quiet urgency. Lucas never saw his father again. He grew up believing the man had chosen not to follow. Over time, anger faded into something quieter, not forgiveness, not resentment, just absence. After his mother died 2 years earlier, the last connection to that past disappeared. Lucas stopped thinking about where he came from. Survival became enough. Now the letter had reopened something he thought was sealed. He folded the paper carefully, then unfolded it again. The address sat at the top. Cedar Ridge, the place where his earliest memories lived. The place he hadn't seen in over 3 decades. Selling the cabin made sense. He had no attachment to it, no reason to keep it. The money would give him distance from everything, a fresh start somewhere quiet. But the thought of signing without seeing it once more felt unfinished. Lucas leaned against the truck, eyes drifting toward the distant tree line. He tried to picture the cabin, a narrow porch, uneven steps, a window catching morning light. He couldn't tell whether those memories were real or reconstructed. Atlas shifted slightly, stepping closer. The dog wasn't looking at Lucas. He was watching the envelope. Lucas noticed. "You think it's that easy?" he murmured. Atlas remained still, ears forward. Lucas imagined signing the papers without ever seeing the place again. The cabin would vanish into someone else's plans. Whatever answers it held, if any, would disappear with it. He had spent decades believing his father chose to leave. But what if that wasn't the whole story? The thought unsettled him more than expected. Selling the cabin would give him money. Going back might give him clarity. He exhaled slowly. "One trip," he said quietly. "Just once." Atlas lifted his head, calm and certain, as if the decision had already been made. Lucas slid the letter into his jacket pocket and opened the truck door. The interior smelled faintly of dust and old coffee. Atlas jumped into the passenger seat smoothly, settling without instruction. Lucas started the engine, the low rumble breaking the stillness. For a moment, he didn't move. The road ahead curved into trees. The past waited somewhere beyond it. He didn't know what he expected to find. Probably nothing. A collapsed structure, rotting wood, silence, something easy to leave behind. But even that felt necessary. Lucas shifted into gear. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as the truck rolled forward. Shadows from tall pines stretched across the road. Atlas watched ahead, calm and alert. Something about that road felt less like leaving, and more like returning to a question Lucas had avoided his entire life. Neither of them looked back. By the time Lucas and Atlas reached Cedar Ridge, the light had thinned into a flat, late-afternoon gray. The road narrowed as the trees thickened, and the town appeared almost without warning, small and weathered beneath the pines. Cedar Ridge was even quieter than Lucas remembered, though memory had become unreliable over the years. A single gas pump stood outside a general store, with peeling white paint and a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. A rusted bell hung above the door, and a faded sign near the window leaned sideways in the wind. The town did not look abandoned. It looked worn down, patient, and used to being overlooked. Lucas parked along the road and cut the engine. For a moment, he stayed where he was, hands still on the wheel. The place stirred something old in him, not a full memory, but a pressure behind one. Atlas turned his head toward him, then toward the store, waiting. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, old wood, and feed grain. Shelves held canned goods, work gloves, batteries, and hardware arranged with practical care. Behind the counter stood an older man with a broad frame that age had bent but not diminished. His name tag read Wes Garner. He wore a faded flannel shirt over a thermal Henley, and his thick hands were marked with old scars and darkened knuckles, the kind that came from years of lifting timber, repairing engines, or doing whatever a small town needed done. His white beard was neatly trimmed, and his face was deeply lined, not just by weather, but by endurance. He had the steady, careful manner of a man who had spent years seeing trouble before it arrived. Wes noticed Atlas before he looked at Lucas. "That's a solid dog," he said in a rough but even voice. "He is," Lucas replied. Atlas stood close to Lucas's leg, calm and controlled, watching the room without pulling at the leash. That seemed to matter to Wes. People in places like Cedar Ridge judged a man by how he handled silence, tools, and dogs. Lucas took the folded letter from his jacket pocket and set it on the counter. "I'm looking for this address." Wes opened it, read the page, and grew still for half a beat. His eyes moved from the address to Lucas's face, then back again, as if matching old information to a changed version of something he had once known. "The Hale place," he said. Lucas felt a quiet tightening in his chest. "You know it?" "Everybody around here used to." Wes folded the letter once and handed it back. "Road's half gone now. You take Miller's Bend, stay on it until you hit the old logging cut. Easy to miss if you're not looking." He paused, then added, "You family?" "My father owned it." Wes studied him more carefully this time. "Then you'd be Lucas." It wasn't the certainty of the words that unsettled him. It was the fact that someone here could still place him inside that name. Lucas had spent so many years thinking of his father as an absence that Hearing the family name spoken like something real made the old story feel less complete. Wes seemed to recognize the resistance in his face and kept his tone measured. "You've got some of your mother in you," he said. "But the rest of you, yeah, that's Hale." Lucas did not ask whether that was meant kindly. Wes reached for a pencil and sketched a rough map onto the back of an old invoice sheet. "Bridge washed out years back, but there's enough stone left under it to cross if you go slow. If the truck won't make it, you walk." Lucas took the paper. "Was anyone living there?" Wes glanced toward the front window, thinking before he answered. "Not lately, but your father wasn't the kind of man who let a place die easy." He rested one forearm on the counter, kept to himself, sure, but he fixed what he could, paid attention, more than most people knew. The comment stayed with Lucas longer than the directions. Back in the truck, he unfolded the hand-drawn map and set it on the seat between himself and Atlas. The dog lowered his nose to it briefly, then looked up again. Lucas started the engine and followed the narrow road out of town. The farther they drove, the more the landscape closed around them. Pine branches brushed the truck. Fallen limbs blocked the path in places, forcing Lucas to stop twice and drag them aside. Each time, Atlas climbed down after him and waited nearby, head up, scanning the woods. The road finally gave way to a broken stretch of dirt and stone where the old bridge had once been. Lucas got out and stood at the creek's edge. Water moved beneath the damaged span over dark rocks, worn smooth by years of current. The crossing looked possible, but only if he took it slow. Atlas stepped forward to the edge, looked across, then back at Lucas, waiting. "Yeah," Lucas said quietly. "I see it." He drove over one wheel at a time, the truck slipping once before catching. When they made it to the other side, he let out a slow breath and kept going. The road narrowed further, until it was no longer really a road at all, just two faint lines through grass, leaves, and damp soil. Then the cabin appeared. It stood deeper in the woods than Lucas had imagined, half obscured by brush and long shadows. Time had worn it down, but not erased it. The roof sagged slightly at one corner. The porch leaned. The outer boards had turned gray with age, though darker streaks of old stain still clung near the windows and under the eaves. One shutter hung crooked. Vines had crept over part of the railing. It should have looked like ruin. Instead, it looked as if it had been resisted. Lucas cut the engine and stayed in the truck for a few seconds, staring through the windshield. This was where his life had begun. And in the story he had carried for decades, this was also where it ended. He had always imagined his father's absence as a single choice, clean and brutal, but the house in front of him did not look like the remains of a life someone had abandoned without a backward glance. It looked like a place someone had held on to for as long as possible. He stepped out into air that smelled of wet bark, pine sap, and old timber. The forest around the cabin was quiet enough that every movement seemed deliberate. A crow called once from somewhere beyond the trees, then fell silent again. Lucas walked toward the porch slowly. Fragments of childhood returned without warning. Sunlight across floorboards, the scrape of a chair, his mother's voice low and soft in another room. He could not tell whether the images were true memories or things rebuilt from longing and absence. Either way, they landed heavily. Atlas moved ahead of him and climbed onto the porch without hesitation. The boards creaked under his weight, but he did not flinch. He reached the front door, sat down squarely in front of it, and stared at the narrow seam between the wood and the frame. He did not bark. He did not paw at the door. He simply sat there, alert and still, as if waiting for something inside to answer. Lucas stepped onto the porch and stopped beside him. Up close, the details disturbed him more than the decay. The brass handle was weathered, but not as corroded as it should have been. Dirt had settled across the boards, but one strip near the wall looked less buried in leaves than the rest, as though wind and neglect had not been allowed to gather there uninterrupted. In one of the front windows, behind the clouded glass, a faded curtain still hung at an angle. That small piece of fabric changed something in him. He had expected emptiness, rot, a dead structure that matched the story he had always believed. Instead, standing there with Atlas fixed on the door and the forest holding still around them, Lucas felt the first real break in that belief. This cabin did not feel like a place someone had walked away from and forgotten. It felt like a place someone had stayed in for far longer than they should have. Lucas turned the brass handle and pushed the front door inward with his shoulder. It opened reluctantly, dragging against the floor with a dry scrape. A wave of cold, stale air met him at once. Mildew, wet wood, dust, and the sealed smell of years without movement. The light inside was weak and uneven. What slipped through the dirty windows fell in thin gray bands across the floorboards, catching dust in the air and the rough outlines of old furniture. Just beyond the doorway stood a narrow table, a chair tilted slightly to one side, and a cast-iron stove sitting black and cold in the corner. The room was not large, but the darkness made it feel deeper than it was. Lucas stepped inside first. Atlas followed without hesitation, moving low and steady, nose already testing the air. Lucas stopped just past the threshold and listened. No voices, no movement, only the old house settling somewhere in its frame. Then a sharp crack sounded from deeper inside. It was only a shutter banging in the wind, but his body reacted before his mind could catch up. His shoulders locked. The room shifted. The weak light, the smell, the close air, all of it broke apart and reassembled into something older and far more dangerous. For one violent second, the cabin was gone. In its place came heat, smoke, dust, broken concrete, the echo of shouted orders, and the certainty that something terrible was already happening. Lucas stumbled back hard enough to hit the wall, his breath shortened into useless pieces, his hands curled tight. Another noise followed, a branch scraping the siding, and suddenly every corner of the cabin felt occupied. His pulse slammed against his throat. The room no longer belonged to the present. Atlas moved immediately. The dog pressed hard into Lucas's legs, forcing him downward before the panic could carry him further. Lucas resisted for a second out of reflex alone, muscles rigid, breath collapsing faster. Atlas leaned in harder, broad shoulder braced against him, guiding him toward the old chair near the wall. The wood creaked as Lucas dropped into it. Atlas stayed close, planted solidly against his knees, his body warm and steady. Lucas grabbed a fistful of the dog's neck fur. That was what reached him first. Not thought, not reason, but texture, coarse fur, heat, weight. Something living and present in the room with him. Atlas lifted his head slightly and held still, amber eyes fixed on Lucas's face. Lucas tried to breathe through his nose, failed, tried again. This time the air came in with the smell of dust, damp pine, rust, and the familiar scent of Atlas's coat. He held on to that. Slowly the room began to return to its real shape. The walls became wood again. The branch outside became only a branch. He sat there for several minutes, one hand buried in Atlas's fur, the other pressed hard against his own knee. Sweat cooled at the back of his neck. He hated these moments, not only because they hurt, but because they stripped away every careful habit he had built to manage them. He hated losing time, hated needing rescue, hated that the past could still force its way into the present without asking permission. When his breathing finally steadied, he let his head dip forward for a moment. "You always know first," he said quietly. Atlas did not move away. The dog's ears softened slightly, but he remained close until Lucas pushed himself back to his feet. The room looked different now that he could see it clearly. Dust coated every surface. A cracked enamel mug sat upside down on the table beside a rusted spoon. The stove held a faint ring of old soot around its base. On a shelf above it, several cloudy jars still stood in a line. The floorboards were littered with dead insects, flakes of paint, and leaves that must have blown in through unseen gaps. Lucas moved deeper into the cabin, slower now, not because he was afraid of the house, but because he was no longer willing to trust his first impression of anything in it. A narrow kitchen opened off the main room. The sink was stained dark with age. One cabinet door hung open on a single hinge. A dish towel still hung from a peg near the wall, stiff with time but folded once, not fallen. The detail caught his attention. So, did a tin of nails on a shelf near the doorway, placed beside a screwdriver that lay almost neatly parallel to the wood. Abandoned places usually gave themselves away all at once. This one didn't. That thought followed him into the bedroom. The room was small, barely large enough for the narrow bed frame against the wall and the dresser beneath the window. The mattress was gone. The curtain had rotted into thin strips. A cracked wash basin sat on the dresser, its edge lined with dust. The floorboards near the foot of the bed showed more wear than the rest of the room, as if someone had stood or knelt there many times. Lucas stopped in the middle of the room and looked around. This had not been just a room in a decaying house. It had been someone's room, very likely his father's. The thought landed with a quiet weight he could not shake. Atlas moved away from him and began working the room in widening circles, nose down, deliberate and focused. He sniffed beneath the dresser, along the baseboards, near the window, then crossed back toward the far corner. Lucas watched without interrupting. He knew the difference between curiosity and intention in the dog's body. This was intention. In the corner lay an old rug, half curled at one edge, its faded red pattern nearly drowned beneath dust. Atlas lowered his head to it, inhaled once, then twice. He looked back at Lucas, then struck the rug with one paw. Dust jumped. Atlas pawed again, harder this time. Lucas crossed the room and crouched beside him. Up close, the rug looked less like a forgotten object and more like something placed there for a reason. Atlas pushed his nose beneath the edge and scraped once more. Lucas took hold of the rug and pulled it back. A single floorboard lay beneath it, marked by shallow scratches near the seam. Not ordinary wear, not random damage. Marks left by something thin forced into the edge more than once. Lucas stared at the wood. Atlas stood over the spot, ears forward, waiting. Lucas lowered his fingertips onto the scratched board and felt a sharp, quiet certainty move through him. Something in this house had been hidden. Lucas hooked his fingers under the scratched floorboard and pulled. The wood resisted for a moment, then lifted with a dry groan, releasing a breath of stale dust from the dark space beneath. Inside lay a small brass key tied with a faded red cord, dulled by age but clearly preserved on purpose. Atlas stood over the spot, ears forward, watching Lucas without moving. For a second, Lucas only stared at it. The key was not decorative, it was practical, worn smooth at the edges from use. The cord had once been bright red, but time had bled the color into a muted rust. He picked it up carefully, brushed dirt from the metal with his thumb, and felt its weight settle into his palm. Hidden things meant intention. Intention meant planning. And planning meant his father had not simply drifted through these last years, waiting for the house to fall apart. Atlas leaned in and sniffed the key once, then looked up at Lucas. "You knew it was there," Lucas murmured. The dog's tail moved once against the floor. Lucas lowered the floorboard back into place, leaving the rug folded away from it. He slipped the key into his jacket pocket and stood slowly, scanning the room again. The bedroom no longer looked like the remains of a forgotten life. It looked like a place where someone had chosen carefully what to hide and what to leave in plain sight. He moved back into the main room with Atlas close behind him. The first rush of discovery had sharpened his thoughts rather than settled them, and he needed movement to keep from spiraling into conclusions too quickly. He found an old broom leaning behind the kitchen door and began pushing dust, leaves, and paint flakes toward the front entrance. The work gave his hands something steady to do, while his mind kept circling the same question. If the key had been hidden beneath the bedroom floor, then what had it been meant to open? As Lucas cleaned, details emerged that had been easy to dismiss before: a repaired split in the window frame, a line of nails hammered above the sink, a screwdriver placed almost neatly beside a tin of old nails, a dish towel hanging from a peg, stiff with age but still folded once. None of it proved anything on its own. Together, though, the details suggested something stronger than neglect. They suggested maintenance, habit, a man doing what he could to hold order together inside a place the world had forgotten. Lucas carried the broom back toward the front wall and reached for an old rag lying in a drawer. He started wiping dust from the wooden paneling in broad strokes. That was when he noticed the picture frame. At first, it was only the angle. The frame leaned slightly to one side, just enough to stand out to someone trained to notice small misalignments. Lucas stepped closer. The picture itself was cheap and forgettable, a faded landscape print of a river and hills under a pale sky. But the frame bothered him. The nail holding it looked newer than the wood around it. The dust on the wall was lighter in a narrow shape behind the edges. Above the frame were faint scratches, the kind left by something that had been lifted and replaced more than once. He went still. That quiet, exact focus returned. The same trained instinct that had once taught him to distrust what looked normal when one detail wasn't. Atlas came to stand beside him, silent. Lucas set the rag down and lifted the frame off the wall. Behind it, cut into the paneling with more care than he expected, was a narrow wooden compartment door with a small keyhole at its center. For a moment, he only looked at it. Then he reached into his jacket and took out the brass key tied with the red cord. The key slid into the lock without resistance. Lucas wrapped his fingers around it and paused. His pulse had picked up again, but this was not fear. It was the strain of standing 1 second away from a truth that might rearrange everything he had believed for most of his life. He turned the key. A soft click answered him from inside the wall. The compartment door gave slightly, then opened. The hidden space behind it was shallow but neatly built, lined in unfinished wood darkened by time. Inside, protected from dust and damp, were several bundles laid in careful order. At the top sat a stack of letters tied with old twine. Under them were photographs. Lucas lifted the photographs first. In the top one, a woman stood in sunlight near the porch, holding a toddler against one hip. His mother looked younger than any version of her he had truly known. Dark hair falling loose around narrow shoulders, pale skin warmed by summer light, a small, unguarded smile on her face. In the child's hand was a blue toy truck. His hand tightened. He looked at the next photograph. The same child sat on the cabin steps, with dirt on his knees and a grin wide enough to erase all doubt. Lucas, younger than memory, whole in a way he did not remember feeling. In another image, a man stood near the porch rail, broad-shouldered and half turned away, one hand lowered toward the boy. His face was partly shadowed, but the jawline, the posture, the shape of him, Lucas knew before he fully admitted that he knew. His father, not imagined, not reduced to absence, real. Captured in a moment that had once existed without question. Beneath the photographs lay a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. Lucas unfolded it carefully and found a toy truck, once painted blue, now dulled and chipped with age. One wheel was cracked. The metal body was dented. He recognized it at once, not from a clear memory, but from the shock of seeing something that had once belonged in his small hands. There was more in the compartment, a knitted scarf, folded with care, carrying the faint dry scent of cedar, a pocket knife with a worn bone handle, a child's drawing bent at the corners, showing a square house, a crooked tree, and 3 stick figures beneath an oversized yellow sun. On the back, in faded handwriting, someone had written, "Lucas, age 4, keep this one." Lucas sat down heavily in the chair near the wall, without realizing he had crossed the room. Atlas came immediately and leaned against his leg, solid and warm. If his father had left without looking back, why keep these things? If he had stopped caring, why preserve the toy truck? Why fold the scarf? Why save the drawing? Why hide the photographs where dust and weather could never touch them? Lucas picked up the bundle of letters. The twine snapped easily between his fingers. The top envelope had no stamp and no address. Only one word written across the front in careful ink faded to brown. Lucas. His throat tightened. The handwriting was firm, slightly slanted, disciplined without looking stiff. He had no memory of seeing it before, yet some part of him recognized it anyway. Recognition did not arrive as certainty. It arrived as pressure, as ache, as the unsettling sense that something long buried had suddenly shifted. He turned the envelope over, but did not open it. Not yet. Instead, he looked again at the contents of the hidden compartment. None of the items were valuable in any ordinary sense. But that was what struck him hardest. These were not possessions saved for worth. They were things saved because someone could not bear to lose what they represented. He lowered his head, one hand covering his mouth. The anger he had carried for years did not disappear. It simply lost its clean edges. In its place rose something more difficult and far less stable, the possibility that he had misunderstood everything. Atlas nudged his forearm gently. Lucas let out a thin breath and looked down at the dog. "What am I supposed to do with this?" Atlas stayed where he was, steady as ever. Lucas looked back at the hidden space, at the letters, the photographs, the scarf, the toy truck, the evidence of a family preserved in secret. The cabin had already changed once in his mind when he realized it did not feel abandoned. Now it changed again. This was not only a place his father had lived, it was a place his father had remembered, and that truth struck Lucas harder than anything he had found so far. Lucas opened the first letter before he could give himself time to hesitate. The paper crackled softly as he unfolded it, its creases worn white with age. Atlas remained pressed against his leg, warm and steady beside the chair, while the dim cabin held its breath around them. Outside, wind moved through the pines in a low hush, but inside the only sound was the dry whisper of paper in Lucas's hands. The handwriting was firm, slightly slanted, and controlled without feeling cold. It belonged to a man who measured his words carefully and expected them to matter. The first line struck Lucas harder than anything he had yet found in the hidden compartment. If you are reading this, then I never found a safe way to tell you the truth myself. Lucas read it again. Then he kept going. Halfway down the page, his father named himself, Nathan Hale. Until that moment, the name had existed in Lucas's mind more as an absence than a person, but the letter gave it shape. Nathan's voice was direct, restrained, and deeply tired. The voice of a man who had spent years forcing himself to think clearly inside fear. Nathan wrote that he had never intended to vanish from his family. He had intended to build something for them in Cedar Ridge, not wealth, not status, just a decent life held together by work that mattered. He had opened a repair and supply business on the edge of town years earlier, the kind of place farmers and tradesmen depended on when equipment broke at the wrong time of year. He repaired small engines, stocked belts and feed parts, sharpened blades, replaced fittings, and kept odd tools on hand because in a place like Cedar Ridge, being useful was often the same thing as surviving. Lucas could almost see him through the sentences. A tall, broad-shouldered man with rough hands and a quiet face, more comfortable fixing what was broken than explaining how he felt. Nathan had been good with tools, slow to anger, and stubborn in the way practical men often are. Not loud, not theatrical, just difficult to move once he decided where he stood. Lucas had spent years imagining a man careless enough to walk away. The man on the page was something else entirely. According to the letter, the business had not collapsed all at once. It had been worn down piece by piece. A shipment of machine belts failed to arrive during lambing season when half the valley needed repairs. A fuel order was delayed without explanation during the coldest week of winter, forcing him to shut his shop for days. A supplier changed his terms overnight after the account was bought by another company. Customers who had worked with Nathan for years suddenly stopped coming, not because they no longer trusted him, but because they were being quietly steered elsewhere. Every setback could be explained on its own. Bad weather, bad luck, bad timing. Together they formed something far more deliberate. Nathan wrote that he did what most men in his position would have done. He borrowed just enough money to keep the doors open while he caught up. It had not been a large loan. That detail was underlined in the letter, not once, but twice. The sum itself should have been manageable. What made it deadly was the source. The men behind the loan did not operate like ordinary lenders. They worked through respectable fronts: supply brokers, land partnerships, transport offices, and local businesses willing to cooperate for a price. They extended help to struggling owners at the exact moment pride had already been wounded and options had narrowed. Then they tightened the conditions around them. Deliveries changed, prices shifted, payment schedules became traps. Businesses that might have recovered under honest pressure were instead arranged to fail. Nathan did not describe them as geniuses. He described them as patient. That line stayed with Lucas. The second letter was shorter and sharper. Nathan wrote that by the time he realized what was happening, he was no longer looking at one bad deal. He was looking at a system. He named families. Elmer Boone, a widower in his 60s with thick shoulders gone soft from age, and a limp earned in the sawmill, had taken a short-term note to replace a damaged compressor in his machine shed. The replacement part arrived late, then wrong, then late again. By the time his work backlog crushed him, the interest had doubled. Marisol Vega, who ran the diner after losing her husband to a highway accident, signed a supply contract that looked fair until every delayed shipment triggered penalties she had never been warned about. She was a compact woman with dark hair streaked at the temples before her time, a quick gaze, and the sort of exhausted pride that made her stand straighter whenever she was being cornered. Benji Lark, not even 30, inherited his uncle's feed barn and took one emergency loan during a dry summer to keep livestock customers from leaving. He was young, narrow-faced, sunburned, and earnest enough to think paperwork meant protection. It didn't. Nathan wrote that he saw the same pattern in each story. A little pressure, then more. Then just enough help to make walking away harder than signing. Lucas turned the page. His father had repaid the principal, every dollar of it. Once he managed that, the men behind the loan lost their cleanest legal route. They could not simply take the cabin or seize the property outright, so they changed tactics. What remained on paper was interest, penalties, and fabricated fees. What happened off paper was worse. They asked questions about Sarah. They knew which days Lucas walked home from school. They mentioned details no stranger should have known. That was the point in the letters where Lucas had to stop reading for a moment. He lowered the pages and stared at the floorboards beneath his boots. The room around him seemed to tighten. All his life he had believed silence had meant indifference. Now he was being asked to imagine silence as protection. It was almost harder to bear. He forced himself back to the page. Nathan wrote about Sarah with a tenderness so restrained, it hurt more than if he had written sentimentally. She had been the first to see the danger clearly. Sarah Hale was tall and narrow-shouldered, with dark auburn hair that turned nearly black in low light, and gray-green eyes that could turn cool whenever she sensed dishonesty. She worked part-time at the town clinic, kept careful records at home, and possessed the kind of steady intelligence that noticed what men preferred not to explain. Nathan admitted that for too long he thought he could manage the threat by working harder, paying faster, enduring more. Sarah understood before he did that these men were not trying to collect money. They were trying to build control over land, over businesses, over the people too isolated to fight back together. When strangers began asking after Lucas by name, Sarah stopped calling it debt and started calling it danger. Nathan wrote that sending Sarah and Lucas away was the first decision he made that felt like cutting off part of himself. But once he understood the scale of what was happening in Cedar Ridge, leaving with them was no longer the safest option. If he disappeared too, the paper trail would go cold. The pressure on the town would continue, and the men behind it would simply move on to the next weakened family. The cabin, weathered and isolated as it was, became the last place he could still control. He could disappear there without vanishing entirely. He could watch. He could keep records. He could stay close enough to the problem to understand its shape. Lucas read one line twice before it fully entered him. I could not protect you by staying visible, and I could not protect anyone by running with you. That was the logic Nathan had lived inside. He worked whatever jobs he could take for cash: fence repair, roofing, engine work, hauling scrap, sharpening blades. He made himself look smaller than he was, poorer than he was, less dangerous than he was. He listened more than he spoke. He copied names, dates, invoices, changes in ownership, vehicle descriptions, delivery schedules, false partnerships, and the quiet ways one business failure seemed to feed another. He watched who came into town too often for investors. He watched who drank too much and talked loose. He watched which office signs changed while the same men kept walking through the same back doors. He stayed because somebody had to remain where the pattern could still be seen. Atlas shifted and laid his head against Lucas's knee. Lucas looked down at him but did not speak. The dog's breathing was slow and even. The next letter described the day Sarah and Lucas left. Nathan had watched from far enough away not to be seen. He wrote that Sarah never turned around, not because she felt nothing, but because if she had looked back, she might not have kept walking. Lucas felt that sentence like a bruise pressing from the inside. He had spent years imagining his childhood as a clean break, a simple abandonment, because simple pain is easier to carry than complicated love. By the time he reached the end of the first bundle, one truth had settled beyond argument. Nathan Hale had not stayed in Cedar Ridge because he lacked the courage to leave. He had stayed because leaving would have meant surrendering the only ground from which he could still fight. Lucas lowered the pages into his lap and stared at the room around him. The dust, the dim window, the hidden compartment still open in the wall, the faded scarf and broken toy truck, lying beside the photographs. Everything in the cabin had changed again, not physically, morally. The place no longer looked like a ruin abandoned by a man who chose himself over his family. It looked like a post held by someone who had chosen the lonelier battle. His anger did not disappear, but it could no longer stay simple. He looked toward the bedroom doorway, then back at the letters in his hands. The words formed in his mind before he was ready for them, and once they did, he could not unhear them. His father had not stayed here to disappear. He had stayed here to fight. Lucas set the letters aside and reached deeper into the hidden compartment. Beneath the photographs and keepsakes lay a different kind of record. Thin notebooks, folded tax notices, clipped newspaper columns, hand-drawn maps, and several stacks of papers bound with brittle rubber bands. The letters had preserved memory. These pages had preserved intent. He pulled out the first ledger and opened it across his knees. The cover was plain brown cardboard, its corners worn smooth from use. Inside, Nathan's handwriting ran in narrow, disciplined columns. Dates, names, invoice numbers, parcel references, vehicle descriptions, transfers, notes in the margins. It was the work of a man who had stopped hoping to be believed and started preparing to prove. Atlas lay beside the chair, his head resting near Lucas's boot, calm and silent. The dog no longer seemed alert for movement in the room. Whatever mattered now was in Lucas's hands. At first, the entries looked disconnected. A missed delivery here, a changed ownership there, a property sold after tax pressure, a business shuttered after a loan transfer. But the farther Lucas read, the less accidental it all became. The same names appeared through different companies. The same mailing addresses surfaced under different letterheads. One transport office became a holding company. A holding company became a developer. A debt changed hands and then reappeared as leverage against land. Lucas turned another page. At the top, written in block letters and underlined twice, was a name he recognized immediately. Oak Hollow Development Group. He stared at it without moving. That was the name in the lawyer's letter. The company offering $30,000 for the cabin. The company that had looked respectable, distant, and practical. But here, in Nathan's ledger, Oak Hollow was not new. It appeared beside distressed sales, tax disputes, transfer notes, and land parcels Nathan had marked as pressured rather than voluntary. In the margin next to one entry, his father had written in darker ink, "Same men, new sign." A chill moved through Lucas that had nothing to do with the cold. He went back through the previous pages more carefully. Oak Hollow had been attached to Elmer Boone's land after the machine shed collapse. It surfaced near a storage lot Marisol Vega had been forced to surrender when her supply penalties mounted. It appeared near Benji Lark's feed property after the drought year. The pattern was no longer abstract. Nathan had mapped it clearly: a struggling owner, a manipulated delay or cost increase, a loan or pressure campaign, then a land offer through a clean front. Lucas let out a slow breath and leaned back in the chair. The $30,000 offer in his pocket changed shape in his mind. It was not a chance event. It was not generosity. It was the same machinery reaching for the same ground under a different name, years later, assuming time had erased the people who once noticed. He kept reading. Nathan had clipped legal notices from the county paper and pinned them to ledger pages with handwritten dates. Property auctions, quiet rezoning requests, tax reassessments, ownership changes filed under Elm LLCs with bland names. Several parcels had been marked with pencil lines connecting them back to Oak Hollow through shell entities. Nathan did not always know every step, but he knew enough to trace the direction of movement. The land did not pass through random hands. It kept returning to the same circle. There were notes on specific men as well. Gerald Voss appeared often. Nathan described him as a tall man in his mid-50s, with silver hair combed neatly back, a clean-shaven face, and the polished calm of someone who preferred to look helpful while closing a trap. He dressed better than anyone in Cedar Ridge needed to, always in pressed coats and polished shoes, and spoke softly enough to make his threats sound like advice. Nathan had marked him as front face, not top, suggesting he was visible, useful, and disposable within the larger structure. Another name came up beside his repeatedly. Milton Sayer, local broker, thick through the neck and middle, dark mustache, quick smile, quicker lies. He wore work boots to look local and expensive watches to remind people he wasn't struggling. Nathan's notes made clear that Sayer was the bridge between outside money and inside pressure. The man who knew which families were vulnerable, which debts could be pushed, which town officials could be leaned on, and who could be made to feel isolated enough to sell. Lucas found one line in the margin that made him almost smile despite the tension in his chest. Sayer jokes before he lies. Watch who laughs. He read on. Another folder held county tax records copied by hand. Some official, some clearly reconstructed from repeated visits and conversations. Nathan had circled several reassessments in red pencil. The cabin's parcel number was among them. So were the properties of Boone, Vega, and Lark. Each reassessment had landed in years when the owners were already under strain. Nathan's note beside one page was brief and cutting. If they can't take the land cheap, make holding it expensive. Lucas lowered the folder and stared at the cabin wall across from him. That was it. That was the pressure point. The back taxes on the cabin were not just bad luck left to rot over time. They fit a larger method, maybe not fabricated from nothing, but allowed to accumulate and sharpen until selling looked more reasonable than fighting. The offer letter from Oak Hollow was not simply business. It was the final step in the same process his father had been tracking for years. Atlas lifted his head when Lucas shifted in the chair. Lucas rested a hand briefly against the dog's neck, grounding himself in the simple fact of another living presence in the room. If I sign, he said quietly, almost to himself, I finish it for them. The words stayed in the air. He looked down again at the records spread over his lap and across the floorboards. Nathan had not built a complete legal case. Not yet, not alone, not from inside this cabin. But he had preserved something more dangerous to the wrong people than rumor, continuity, names linked to dates, dates linked to transactions, transactions linked to land, enough to show pattern, enough to show intent, enough maybe for someone with reach to push further, and if the cabin changed hands, all of it could vanish. Lucas thought of bulldozers, survey stakes, fresh paint on a new sign. He thought of workers tearing open walls, hauling out broken furniture, clearing out old junk from a property they claimed had no history worth keeping. He thought of the hidden compartment exposed and emptied before anyone knew what it had held. The possibility struck him with sudden clarity. Selling the cabin would not just end his connection to the place. It would bury his father's unfinished work under the very company that had spent years trying to erase it. He set the tax records aside and picked up one of Nathan's hand-drawn maps. The valley had been sketched with practical precision. Logging roads, creek bends, fence lines, parcels, access routes, buildings marked only by initials. Several plots were shaded lightly. Others were circled. The cabin sat near the edge of a cluster Nathan had marked with one word. Holdouts. Lucas stared at it. His father had not seen these people as isolated victims. He had seen them as the remaining line. Outside, dusk had deepened. The trees beyond the dirty windows had turned into layered shadow. The cabin dimmed by the minute, but Lucas still did not move to leave. Earlier that day, this place had been a problem to solve, a burden to price out, a relic to inspect before selling. Now it felt different, not safe exactly, but purposeful. Atlas shifted closer and lay against his boots. The silence no longer felt empty. Lucas looked from the map to the ledger, from the ledger to the offer letter folded in his jacket pocket. He could still picture the money clearly, $24,000 after taxes and fees, enough to erase several immediate worries. But now he could also see the cost of taking it, not abstractly, specifically. Paper by paper, name by name, line by line. Nathan had hidden these records because he believed someone might one day need them. And for the first time since opening the first letter, Lucas no longer felt like an intruder in his father's unfinished life. He felt like he had been led to the exact point where the story expected him to stand. He placed the ledger back beside the others with care, as if returning a tool to its place. Atlas remained silent at his side, but this time, Lucas did not feel lost. Lucas stayed in the cabin that night, because leaving in the dark made less sense than remaining where he could still see what mattered. He cleared a corner of the table, found an old lantern with enough fuel left to burn, and ate from the emergency food stored in his truck, while Atlas lay near the front door, watchful even when still. The room felt different now, not safe exactly, but no longer empty. The records hidden in the wall had given the place weight, and with that weight came a new kind of tension. The first sign came before full dark. Lucas was checking the side window latch when he heard the low hum of an engine somewhere beyond the trees. He stopped at once and listened. The sound faded, then returned from a slightly different angle, as if a vehicle had driven down the logging road, paused, and turned back. Atlas rose without command, body tightening, ears pitched toward the front of the house. Lucas crossed to the window and lifted the edge of the curtain just enough to see out. Through the branches he caught a flash of headlights, then darkness, then headlights again moving slowly through the trees. Not a passerby. No one passed this way by accident. Whoever it was had come to look. The lights never reached the porch. After a minute, the engine receded and the woods went quiet again. But it was no longer the ordinary quiet of a rural night. It was the kind that comes after being noticed. Lucas kept the lantern low and did not sleep in the bedroom. He stayed in the main room with one of Nathan's maps folded beside him and the hidden compartment closed. Atlas remained near the door, resting but not relaxed. Several times Lucas thought he heard movement outside, but when he listened more carefully, there was only the old house shifting and the wind passing through the pines. Even so, sleep came shallow and badly, broken by the sense that the darkness around the cabin was not empty. He woke before sunrise to the sound in Atlas's throat. Not barking, not even a full growl at first. Just a low vibration, controlled and deliberate, the sound the dog made when something had crossed from possible to real. Lucas was awake instantly. Atlas stood at the front door, rigid and silent except for that deep warning in his chest. Then Lucas heard it too. Weight on the porch boards. One step, then another. Slow, measured, human. Lucas moved to the side of the doorway instead of standing in front of it. Habit did the thinking for him. He stayed silent and listened. Two men, one shifting his stance more heavily than the other. Leather creaking, a boot dragging once against the wood. Then came a voice through the door, smooth and almost friendly. "Morning." Lucas said nothing. The same voice continued. "Didn't mean to wake you. Just thought somebody ought to tell you this place isn't worth staying in." The second man gave a short laugh, low and humorless. Lucas kept one hand braced lightly against the wall. "Then say it from the yard." A pause followed. Then the first man answered, still calm. "No reason to make this harder than it needs to be. Land like this has a way of becoming trouble. Storms, roads washing out, trees coming down. Old structures don't always hold." The other man stepped closer. The porch boards answered under his weight. When he spoke, his voice was rougher, less practiced. The kind of voice that did not care whether it sounded threatening because it already knew it did. Sell while somebody still wants it. Atlas's growl deepened. Lucas felt his pulse climb, but his voice remained even. "You boys done?" The first man gave a short exhale, not quite a sigh, not quite a laugh. "Just think carefully before you decide to stay out here alone." The footsteps withdrew a moment later, not hurried, not embarrassed. The kind of retreat men make when they believe they have already delivered the message that matters. Lucas waited until he heard the steps descend, gravel shift, a vehicle door shut, and an engine turn over somewhere beyond the clearing. Only then did he move to the window and lift the curtain slightly. A dark pickup rolled away through the trees, broad-bodied and mud-streaked, moving slowly enough to suggest confidence. Lucas caught no plate, just shape, color, and the fact that they had known exactly where to stop. Atlas stayed by the door for several minutes after the truck was gone, tension holding through his shoulders. Morning made the cabin look ordinary again, but not innocent. Gray light spread over the clearing, revealing damp earth, wet boards, and the faint damage of a night that had not been as quiet as it first appeared. Lucas opened the front door and stepped onto the porch with Atlas close at his side. The first thing he saw was the rail. One section had been kicked loose and now leaned outward from the post, split at one joint. Fresh scuffs marked the boards near the top step. The side window screen had been slashed. The latch on the tool shed behind the cabin had been chopped through, leaving the door hanging open by one hinge. None of it was enough to destroy anything. That was the point. The damage was measured, almost careful, a demonstration, not an attack. Then Lucas walked to the truck. The rear tire on the driver's side sat flattened against the dirt. He stopped there with one hand on the bed rail and closed his eyes for a moment. Fatigue hit him harder than fear. Real, physical fatigue. The kind that made one simple option glow brighter than every other thought. Take the money, walk away, let the whole rotten history bury itself. $24,000, a fresh town, no night visitors, no hidden records, no old war inherited from a father who was already gone. He could still do that. Sell the place, leave the papers, tell himself the evidence was incomplete, and none of this belonged to him. He stood with that thought longer than he liked. Atlas came around the truck and stopped in front of him. The dog did not whine or nudge. He only stood there for a second, then turned and walked back toward the porch. At the bottom of the steps, he stopped and looked over his shoulder. Lucas stared back at him. The cabin stood behind the dog, worn and damaged and stubbornly upright. For an instant, Lucas saw it exactly as the men in the truck must have seen it. Old wood, back taxes, a lone owner far from help. Then he saw it the way Nathan had seen it, the last piece of ground that had not yet been surrendered. That was what changed him. Not bravery, not anger, recognition. If he left now, he would not simply be abandoning a house. He would be handing the final word to the same people who had spent years cornering men like his father until surrender felt reasonable. Lucas drew in a long breath and let it out slowly. Then he turned away from the flat tire and walked back toward the porch. Atlas stayed where he was until Lucas reached the steps. Then the dog moved aside and fell in beside him. Lucas looked once at the broken rail, once at the slashed screen, once into the trees beyond the clearing. "I'm not leaving," he said quietly, and for the first time, the decision felt entirely like his own. Lucas left the cabin that morning not to walk away from it, but to keep what was hidden there from being buried again. He packed the letters, ledgers, maps, and tax records into an old canvas tool bag and carried them with the care of someone moving something more fragile than paper. The flat tire cost him time and patience, but not his direction. He changed it in the cold mud while Atlas stood near the edge of the clearing, scanning the logging road, as if he expected the dark pickup to return before Lucas had the lug nuts tightened. By the time they reached the county seat, the sky had flattened into a pale, washed gray. The law office sat in an older brick building, with tall windows and a brass directory plate dulled by years of weather and fingerprints. Lucas sat in the truck for a moment after killing the engine, one hand still on the canvas bag. This was the first time he had carried his father's hidden life out into the open. Atlas looked at him once, steady and calm, then waited. Inside, the office smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and furniture polish. A young receptionist sat behind the front desk, small-framed and tidy, with light brown hair pinned into a practical knot, and the attentive face of someone trained to notice what mattered without staring at it. Her name tag read Mara Quinn. She looked first at Lucas, then at Atlas, then back to Lucas. "Can I help you?" Lucas gave his name and mentioned the Cedar Ridge property. Recognition passed across her face almost immediately. "Mr. Hale?" "Yes. Ms. Mercer is in." Her tone became more formal as she reached for the phone. She glanced again at Atlas. "Your dog can stay with you if he remains close." "He will." A minute later, the inner office door opened, and Evelyn Mercer stepped out herself. She was in her early 60s, tall and spare, with silver hair cut neatly to the jaw, and a face sharpened more by discipline than by age. Her dark eyes moved quickly, taking in Lucas, the bag in his hand, and the dog at his side before settling into stillness. She wore a charcoal suit with no wasted detail and carried herself like a woman who had spent years cutting through confusion without raising her voice. Nothing about her suggested softness, but nothing about her suggested carelessness either. "Mr. Hale," she said, offering her hand. "Come in." Her office was plain and orderly. A framed county map hung on one wall beside two old black and white farm photographs. The desk held no decorative clutter, only files stacked in purposeful lines. Lucas sat only after she did. Atlas lowered himself beside the chair, quiet and close. Evelyn's eyes moved once to the canvas bag. You went to the cabin. Yes. And you did not sign the sale documents. No. Something in her expression sharpened, not with surprise, but with attention. Then something changed. Lucas set the bag on the desk, opened it, and began laying out the contents one piece at a time. Letters, ledgers, clipped notices, maps, tax records, handwritten notes. Evelyn did not interrupt him. She waited until the first stack was in front of her, then drew one ledger closer and opened it. The room changed almost at once. Lucas had expected skepticism first, maybe caution, maybe professional distance. Instead, he saw Evelyn recognize structure. Her eyes moved over the page, then back to the margin notes, then to the parcel references. She reached for a tax reassessment page without being prompted. Then, one of the clipped legal notices. Then, the map with shaded parcels. She was not being polite. She was following the pattern. "How much of this have you read?" she asked without looking up. "Enough. Enough to know this isn't just about one property?" "Yes." She turned another page, then finally looked at him. "No," she said. "It isn't." Lucas felt something loosen and tighten at the same time. Evelyn pulled a legal pad toward her and began writing in quick, deliberate strokes. "Your father was more methodical than most people I represent," she said. "He may not have built a prosecutable case by himself, but he preserved what matters most at the beginning of one: continuity." She tapped the ledger once. Names tied to dates, dates tied to transactions, transactions tied to land. That matters. Lucas leaned forward slightly. "You see it too. I see organized pressure disguised as business." She turned a page. "Predatory lending, likely layered through shell entities, coordinated valuation pressure, strategic acquisitions through fronts." Her eyes lifted again. "And I see enough here to justify taking this seriously immediately." That, more than anything else, made Lucas decide he had come to the right place. Evelyn read several more entries, then stopped at the page where Oak Hollow Development Group was underlined. "This is the current buyer?" Lucas nodded. "Same name as the offer letter." "Then your father was right about one important thing," she said. "The sign changed. The machinery didn't." She set the page down and began outlining steps with the same tone she might have used to explain weather or surgery. Precise, unsentimental, unavoidable. First, every document would be scanned and duplicated before anything else happened. Second, she would file an immediate request to extend the tax deadline on the cabin, citing newly discovered estate records requiring preservation and review. Third, she would prepare a referral package for a state-level investigator she trusted, rather than begin with local channels that might already be too close to the land network Nathan had been tracking. Lucas listened without interrupting. "You will also keep the property exactly as it is for now," she said. "Do not repair visible damage beyond what is necessary for safety. Photograph everything: dates, times, tire marks, broken latches, torn screens, footprints, all of it. If someone speaks to you, write down the wording as closely as you remember it." Lucas thought of the men on the porch. "They came this morning." Evelyn's pen stopped. "Tell me." So, he did. He described the dark pickup in the trees the night before, the footsteps on the porch before sunrise, the two men outside the door, one smooth-voiced and almost courteous, the other heavier, rougher, and more direct. He repeated the warning about the land, the line about selling while it was still wanted, the damage to the rail, the slashed screen, the broken shed latch, the flattened tire. Evelyn took notes the entire time. She did not dramatize it. She did not soften it either. When he finished, she tore the page cleanly from the pad and clipped it to the front of the file. "Good," she said. "That begins your incident record." Lucas frowned slightly. "Good?" "Good that it exists in writing now," she replied. "Not just in memory." She called for Mara, who entered with a legal folder in one hand and a question already forming in her eyes. When she saw the spread of documents, she stopped asking questions without needing to be told. Evelyn instructed her to lock the copy room and bring in the high-resolution scanner. Mara moved quickly and returned with it 2 minutes later, efficient and silent. "These do not leave this office digitally except through me," Evelyn told her. No outside drive, no cloud sync, no discussion. Yes, ma'am. As Mara began scanning page by page, the room filled with the soft mechanical rhythm of the machine. Lucas watched his father's handwriting pass beneath the glass. It felt strange, almost intimate, to see those hidden records translated into light and copies and procedure. This was no longer just a secret discovered in a wall. It was becoming evidence with a path. Atlas remained unmoving through all of it, chin lifted slightly, eyes following Lucas more than anyone else. Mara noticed. "He's remarkably calm," she said quietly. "He knows when to be," Lucas answered. Evelyn didn't look up from the notes she was organizing. Animals are often better judges of threshold moments than people. It was the closest thing to warmth she had offered yet. Once the first set of scans was complete, Evelyn turned back to Lucas. "Mr. Hale, listen carefully. If your father preserved this much, then someone may already suspect the cabin holds more than old furniture. They may escalate, or they may become polite again. Either way, do not mistake form for intent." Lucas nodded. "You do not sign anything. You do not let anyone onto the property without reason. You document first, clean second. And if there is another incident, you call me before you call anyone local unless there is immediate danger to life." Lucas absorbed that in silence. A month ago, he might have heard those instructions as the beginning of a burden too large to carry. Sitting here now, they sounded like something else. A structure, a way forward. He looked down at the originals stacked beside the bag, then at the copies now clipped into fresh legal folders. The divide between the hidden life in the cabin and the real world outside it had narrowed. Nathan's records no longer belonged only to memory, dust, and secrecy. They now had witnesses. "All right," Lucas said. Evelyn waited, reading the rest of the answer in his face before he finished speaking. "I'll keep the cabin as it is. I'll document everything, and I'm not selling." This time, Evelyn let a fraction of her approval show. "Good." The word was simple, but it landed with more force than reassurance would have. Lucas packed the originals back into the canvas bag, while the copies remained in Evelyn's control. When he rose to leave, he no longer felt like a man carrying a dead father's papers to someone more qualified. He felt like a man stepping into a line that had been waiting for him long before he arrived. At the outer door, Mara held it open while Atlas moved through first. The afternoon had gone colder. A weak stripe of sun crossed the courthouse roof across the street, then disappeared behind cloud again. Lucas rested one hand on the truck door before getting in. This time, turning back toward Cedar Ridge did not feel like being trapped by the past. It felt like returning to it on purpose. Lucas returned to the cabin before dark with Atlas beside him and the last of Evelyn Mercer's instructions fixed clearly in his mind. He parked facing the road, not the house. Before bringing anything inside, he walked the clearing once more with his phone, taking fresh photographs of the broken rail, the slashed screen, the damaged shed latch, and the tire marks still visible near the porch. Then he added the time, weather, and sequence of damage to the black notebook Mercer had given him. The work steadied him. It gave shape to the fear. Inside, he kept the cabin as it was. The originals remained hidden in the wall. A few copied pages stayed locked in the truck beneath the spare blanket and jack kit. He checked the lantern, charged his phone from the truck battery, and slipped the small recorder Mercer had handed him into his jacket pocket. Atlas followed each movement without getting in the way, quiet and watchful, the same way he had been in hospital waiting rooms, motel lots, and nights when Lucas had woken gasping from old wars. The dog did not need explanations. He only needed to know when Lucas had decided not to run. Before sunset, Lucas called Deputy Aaron Pike from the porch. The deputy answered on the second ring. "We're in position," Pike said. "You do exactly what we discussed. Keep them talking. Don't force it. Don't threaten. Don't open more space than you need to." Lucas looked out toward the darkening road. "And if they don't come? Then you document a quiet night and we wait for the next one." Lucas nodded, though Pike could not see it. "Understood." By full dark, the cabin had narrowed into lamplight and shadow. Lucas kept the lantern low and the front room dim. Atlas lay near the door, but he was not resting. Every few minutes his ears shifted toward the woods, then toward the logging road, then back to Lucas. The silence outside no longer felt empty. It felt occupied by possibility. The truck arrived just after 10. No circling this time, no testing pass. The engine came straight down the road, slowed at the clearing, and stopped. Atlas rose at once. Lucas slid the recorder on inside his jacket and stood to the side of the door. He did not touch the chain lock yet. He listened first. 2 doors opened. 2 men stepped out. Gravel shifted. Boots crossed the dirt. Then came the porch. A knock sounded against the wood, more firm than polite. "Mr. Hale," called the smooth voice. "We should finish this tonight." Lucas opened the door only as far as the chain allowed. The man standing closest to the gap was exactly the kind of man Nathan's notes had described. Gerald Voss was tall and narrow through the waist, with silver hair combed back neatly from a lined forehead and a clean-shaven face that might have looked respectable anywhere else. His features were precise, almost elegant, but his pale eyes carried no warmth. Everything about him suggested control: the dark field coat, the polished boots, the way he stood just outside the light, as if he preferred to remain difficult to read. Milton Sayer stood half a step behind him, broader and heavier, thick through the chest and neck, with a dark mustache cut close and a smile that appeared too fast to be sincere. His boots were muddy, his denim too expensive for honest labor, and one hand rested against a folded packet of papers under his arm. He looked like a man who spent his life pretending to belong in every room he entered, until people got too tired to question it. "You've had time to think," Voss said. His voice was soft, almost courteous, but it carried the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Lucas kept the door steady. "About what?" Sayer let out a low breath through his nose. "Don't do that." Voss gave the faintest smile. "The property, the offer, the fact that everyone's life gets easier if we stop pretending this place is worth a problem." Atlas moved into the narrow space behind the door and stood squarely at Lucas's side. He did not lunge or bark. A low sound began in his chest, almost below hearing. Voss's eyes dropped to the dog. "You should keep him back." "He is back," Lucas said. Sayer unfolded the packets and tapped the pages once against his palm. "Revised agreement. Better number. We came all the way out here to make this easy for you." Lucas glanced at the papers without reaching for them. "How much better?" 32, said Sayer. "You sign tonight, we move fast on the tax issue. County pressure goes away. No more surprises out here." That was the first thing that told Lucas they were pushing too hard, not the threat, the eagerness. Men confident of ownership did not sweeten deals in the dark unless they needed something finished before daylight reached the wrong people. "Generous," Lucas said. "It's practical," Voss replied. Lucas let the silence work. Then he looked more carefully at the top page. The logo was right. The formatting was not. The parcel description was abbreviated incorrectly, and the witness line was blank. Even from behind the chain, he could tell the papers had been assembled for speed, not for scrutiny. "You missing a county filing on that?" Lucas asked. Sayer's expression hardened first. Voss's came a second later, smaller but colder. "We're trying to save you time," Voss said. "Looks more like you're trying to save yourselves a trip." Atlas's growl deepened. Sayer stepped forward, enough to draw the chain taut. "Listen to me," he said, dropping the last of the fake ease. "You are alone in a rotting cabin with overdue taxes and no help close enough to matter. Sign the paper." Lucas did not raise his voice. "Take one more step and you'll regret it." That stopped him, not because Lucas sounded loud, but because he sounded certain. Voss tried once more to wrap the threat in civility. "Mr. Hale, stories have a way of sounding important in private, but paper hidden in walls won't change who owns this county." Lucas met his eyes. "Maybe not tonight." Something shifted in Voss's face then. Not fear, but recognition that the conversation was no longer proceeding by the script he had expected. Sayer lifted the papers again as if to force them through the gap. "Last chance." Headlights exploded through the trees behind them. Both men turned at once. A second set followed immediately, then red and blue strobes cut across the clearing, the porch, the broken rail, the side of the cabin. Gravel spat under fast tires. Car doors opened hard. "Sheriff's Department!" shouted a voice from the yard. "Step away from the door!" Deputy Aaron Pike came up the path first, his body already angled for control, one hand near his holster but not on it. Behind him came another deputy wide to the side, and just behind them a woman in a dark state investigator's jacket, moved with clipped, controlled speed. Leah Darnell looked to be in her early 40s, medium height, with close-cropped black hair and a face composed into still concentration. Her features were strong without being severe, her brown skin catching the wash of patrol lights across the porch. She carried no visible impatience, only the kind of focus that made other people sound flimsy when they lied. One look at the scene, chain-locked door, dog braced in the threshold, papers in Sayer's hand, Voss half-turned toward retreat, and she already seemed to know where the center of it was. "Hands where we can see them," Pike ordered. Sayer swore under his breath and stepped back. Voss recovered faster, raising one hand and keeping the other visible. "This is a misunderstanding." "No," Pike said. "It's a recorded contact. Set the documents down." The words landed. Lucas watched Voss realize, in one brief and costly second, that the conversation had not remained private. Sayer dropped the pages onto the porch boards, as if they had suddenly become hot. Leah stepped forward only after Pike had both men turned away from the door. She bent, lifted the top sheet carefully by the corner, and glanced at the signature block. "These are not county-filed forms," she said. "Of course they aren't," Pike answered. Atlas remained in the doorway, body hard and still, a living barrier between Lucas and the men on the porch. He did not attack. He did not need to. The growl in his chest was enough to make the line visible. Pike moved Voss toward the steps, while the second deputy took Sayer by the arm. Voss tried once more to recover composure. "You're making a mistake." Leah didn't look at him when she answered. "That depends who's been making them longest." The deputies led both men off the porch. Patrol lights washed across the clearing and then across Lucas's face. He stood with one hand on the inside edge of the door, Atlas in front of him, and watched them go. His pulse was high, his hands were not steady, he was not fearless, but he did not move backward, not one step. For the first time since returning to Cedar Ridge, Lucas stood in the exact place where pressure had meant retreat for years, and stayed there. By the time the first hard frost silvered the grass around the cabin, several months had passed since the night Gerald Voss and Milton Sayer were stopped on the porch. The investigation had not ended cleanly, and Cedar Ridge had not transformed into a town of easy justice. Papers still moved too slowly. Lawyers still wrote letters. Men with money still believed they could outlast memory. But something had shifted. Oak Hollow was being examined from angles it had once controlled. A tax extension had been granted on the cabin. Several land transfers linked to older shell companies were under review. The machinery Nathan Hale had spent years tracking had not disappeared, but it was no longer invisible. Lucas learned quickly that victory, if it came at all, would not arrive as a single moment. It would look more like winter work, unglamorous, repetitive, and necessary. So, he worked. He repaired the porch first, because a broken entrance makes a place look defeated even when it still stands. He reset the split rail, reinforced the steps, patched the torn screen, and rehung the shed door with hardware strong enough to outlast another warning. Atlas stayed near him through every task, sometimes stretched in the grass with his head on his paws, sometimes up and scanning the tree line if an engine lingered too long on the road below. Lucas no longer mistook that vigilance for fear. It was simply how the dog loved him, by staying awake where Lucas had once gone numb. Help did not arrive all at once. It came the way trust usually does in small towns, sideways, practical, pretending not to be sentiment. The first to show up was Cal Monroe, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, with a white-streaked beard and hands marked by roofing nails, engine grease, and old winters. He carried a red toolbox in one hand and a paper sack of sandwiches in the other. Cal was the kind of man who wasted neither words nor movement. His back had stiffened with age, but his judgment had not dulled with it. He studied the porch rail for half a minute before saying, "You set that brace wrong, spring will teach you the same lesson twice." Then set down the toolbox and got to work beside Lucas as though the decision had already been made. By evening, the porch stood straighter than it had in years. Before leaving, Cal only said, I know where to find reclaimed windows if that front frame gives you trouble." A few days later, Marisol Vega came up the steps carrying a pot of stew and a loaf wrapped in a kitchen towel. She was smaller than Lucas had pictured from Nathan's letters, compact and wiry, with dark hair gone silver at the temples and sharp eyes that had long ago learned the difference between misfortune and manipulation. Widowhood had not made her soft. It had made her exact. She handed him the food and said, "I don't feed every man in this county, so don't make me regret starting with you." It was the closest thing to kindness she could offer without dressing it up, which made it feel more honest. While Atlas accepted a scrap of bread from her with careful restraint, Marisol told Lucas something he carried for weeks afterward. "Your father wasn't popular with the right people," she said. "That usually means he was still worth something." More work followed, because work had a way of revealing itself once people believed a man might stay. Wes Garner gave Lucas regular hours at the general store 3 mornings a week, hauling feed sacks, fixing hinges, unloading deliveries, mending what age and weather broke faster than the town could replace it. The pay was modest, but the rhythm mattered. So did the simple fact of being expected somewhere. On the other days, Lucas repaired porch steps, rehung barn doors, patched roofs, replaced stovepipes, and cut fallen limbs for older residents who could no longer manage them alone. He had spent years thinking survival meant never being needed for long. Cedar Ridge taught him, slowly, that usefulness could be another form of shelter. One of the first paid jobs outside the store came from Mrs. Evelyn Pike, Deputy Pike's aunt. She was bird-thin and sharply upright despite her age, with white hair pinned in a loose twist, and eyes so clear they made most people feel mildly dishonest. She hired Lucas to rebuild her back steps, paid him in cash and blackberry preserves, and informed him, without looking up from her porch rocker, that Nathan Hale had once fixed her storm cellar latch during a flood year and refused full payment because her husband was dying. "So, if you do poor work for me now," she said, "I'll take it personally on your father's behalf." Lucas did not do poor work. Winter passed in labor and quiet routines. The cabin changed board by board. Lucas scrubbed mildew from walls, reset the cracked window sash, oiled the dresser in the bedroom, and repaired the stove until it could throw real heat into the room instead of memory. A pipeline near the back finally held after Cal helped him reseat it. Fresh curtains went up in the main room. The lantern became backup instead of necessity. For the first time since arriving, Lucas could sit in the cabin at night without feeling as though he were borrowing time inside someone else's unfinished life. The room that had once hidden Nathan's ledgers remained the emotional center of the house, but Lucas stopped treating it like a sealed wound. He framed one of the old photographs of Sarah holding him on the porch. He placed the repaired toy truck on the shelf above the desk. Nathan's pocket knife went into the top drawer, beside the newer tools Lucas used every day. None of it erased grief, but it changed its temperature. The cabin no longer felt like a mausoleum built out of misunderstanding. It felt like a conversation still going on. By spring, people began quietly directing others his way. A hiker from the county seat needed help reaching a trailhead after spring washouts shifted the old access route. 2 bird watchers asked if the ridge above the creek still held hawks in late afternoon. Lucas guided them both for a fee that felt modest until it was added to the rest of the week's work. Then came anglers, a surveyor who didn't trust maps printed after the logging roads were abandoned, and a history teacher curious about old property lines near the valley. Lucas discovered he knew the land better each week, not because he had inherited it, but because he was finally staying long enough to learn it. That same spring, the cabin began doing something Lucas had not planned, but did not resist. The first veteran to stay there was Darren Pike, no close relation to Aaron despite the name. Darren was in his mid-30s, broad through the shoulders, with a wrestler's frame gone slightly heavy from years of moving less than he once had. His blonde hair was clipped short. His face was still young enough to look out of place with the tiredness behind his eyes. He had served with the National Guard and now worked irregular jobs when his sleep allowed it. Wes sent him out one evening with the offhand comment that Hale's place is quiet in the right way. Darren stayed one night, then 3. He split wood, spoke little, and left a folded note under the sugar tin that read only, "I slept through till morning. Thanks." The second was Tessa Morgan, a former medic in her early 40s with dark hair kept short at the jaw and a left knee that stiffened badly on cold mornings. She carried herself with the contained competence of someone used to crisis and not particularly impressed by people who dramatized it. She spent 2 nights in the smaller room, drank coffee black, and one morning said to Lucas, "This place gives people something most of them forgot how to trust, not safety, quiet." He thought about that sentence for a long time after she left. Atlas accepted them all in his own measured way. He lay near the porch post or the stove, watching every new arrival first as a guard, then as a host once they had passed whatever test mattered to him. He never became careless with strangers, never begged, never wandered far when someone unfamiliar slept under that roof. Yet children from town learned quickly that if they approached slowly and let him decide, Atlas would allow a solemn pat on the head before resuming his watch. He did not belong to everyone, but he had become part of what made the place feel steady. As the seasons turned, Lucas noticed other changes too. He still woke too quickly some nights. Sudden noises still moved through his nerves faster than reason could sometimes catch them. Healing had not arrived as a miracle and did not pretend to be permanent. But now, when panic brushed close, it met things that had not been there before: work waiting in the morning, a dog who knew how to anchor him, a store that expected him on Thursdays, a porch he had rebuilt with his own hands, and a town where more people nodded than stared. The life taking shape around him did not cancel the past. It gave it somewhere to live without ruling everything. One late autumn afternoon, after guiding 2 hikers along the ridge above the old creek crossing, Lucas came back to the cabin with sawdust on his sleeves and cold sun caught low between the pines. Atlas was already stretched across the porch boards, head lifted at the sound of the truck. Lucas sat beside him without going inside first. The rail beneath his elbow was warm where the light still touched it. Beyond the clearing, the forest rolled away in long, dark folds, patient and immense. Somewhere beyond those trees lay the town: Wes's store, Marisol's diner, Mrs. Pike's back steps, the sheriff's office, the courthouse, the roads where history had once narrowed into fear. The investigation was still moving. Voss still had lawyers. Oak Hollow was not yet finished. But the machinery had been interrupted, named, forced into light. That mattered. Lucas looked out over the pines and thought of Nathan not as a ghost now, but as a man who had held his ground long enough for someone else to return to it. His father had not left him money. He had not left safety, or ease, or the kind of inheritance banks understand. He had left the truth. He had left land not yet surrendered. He had left a place that could become home again if someone chose to stay. For years, Lucas had lived as though motion itself could protect him, as though never belonging anywhere might spare him the pain of loss. Sitting on the porch with Atlas breathing quietly beside him, he understood the cost of that kind of life more clearly than ever before. It had not saved him. It had only kept him unfinished. The cabin no longer felt like the place where everything in his family had broken. It felt like the place where something honest had finally begun to hold. And for the first time in many years, Lucas did not feel lost at all. In the end, Lucas did not just recover a cabin. He recovered the truth, the dignity of his father's sacrifice, and the part of himself that had been wandering for years without a place to rest. What began as an old inheritance became a new beginning. Through honest work, loyal companionship, and the quiet kindness of a small community, Lucas learned that healing does not always arrive like lightning. Sometimes it comes like morning light through old trees, slow, steady, and impossible to stop once it begins. The cabin became more than a home. It became proof that broken things can still shelter life, and that people who have suffered deeply can still become a refuge for others. In a world that often teaches us to leave, this story reminds us that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is stay, rebuild, and let love grow where pain once lived. If this story touched your heart, maybe that is no accident. Sometimes miracles do not come like thunder, but as quiet mercies along the way: a loyal dog, a truth revealed, a hand reaching at the right time, a second chance we did not expect. Sometimes God does not calm the storm at once. Sometimes He walks us through it, step by step, until we see we were never alone. Whatever you are carrying today, may His grace find you, strengthen your heart, guide your steps, and fill your home with peace.